Perfectionism is the ultimate double-edged sword for those of us with ADHD. On one hand, it pushes us to strive for excellence, but on the other hand, it can paralyze us with fear and self-doubt. It's like we're constantly chasing an impossible standard, and it's exhausting. But here's the thing, for those of us with ADHD, perfectionism isn't just some minor character trait. It can be a major obstacle that holds us back in all areas of life. The constant need to do things just right can lead to chronic procrastination, missed deadlines, burnout, and damaged relationships. At the end of the day, striving for perfection can become its own form of self-sabotage. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at the perfectionism trap that so many ADHDers fall into and explore why our brains are wired for perfectionistic thinking and how those thought patterns can actually lead to worse outcomes over time. More importantly, I'll share some practical strategies that you can start using today to break free from the perfectionism paradox and start getting things done. So let's unpack perfectionism a little bit more and how it shows up specifically for those of us with ADHD brains. The thing is, perfectionism isn't just about wanting things to be flawless or mistake-free. It's a mindset that can infiltrate every single part of our lives. Research has identified two main types of perfectionism that are particularly relevant for ADHDers. Type 1 perfectionism is excellence-seeking perfectionism. This is when we feel like whatever we're working on, whether it's a project at work or a school assignment or a hobby, can't be considered done until it meets some unrealistically high standard in our minds. We might agonize over tiny details or spend way too much time trying to improve things that are already good enough, or resist turning in work because we're convinced that it's not up to par. Then there's type 2 perfectionism, which is failure-avoiding perfectionism. This is when we feel like we can't even start a task unless the circumstances are just right. Maybe we tell ourselves that we need to wait until we're in the perfect mood or have a big chunk of uninterrupted time, or our workspace is meticulously organized. Basically, we're putting off all of these unnecessary preconditions in a place before we give ourselves permission to begin. I know I've fallen into the type 2 trap plenty of times. I used to convince myself that I couldn't sit down to write unless I had my favorite coffee, my ideal lighting, my ideal air temperature, a completely clutter-free desk, coming up with all of this productive procrastination. But guess what? Those perfect circumstances never materialize. Ultimately, it just means that a lot of important things just don't get done. But both of these perfectionist mindsets can lead to major problems in day-to-day life for us ADHDers. They can make relatively straightforward tasks feel impossibly daunting. They can cause us to procrastinate and miss deadlines. They can fill us with anxiety and dread because we're so worried that our efforts won't measure up to the crazy high expectations that we set for ourselves. At its core, perfectionism is often a misguided attempt to avoid discomfort. With type 1, we're trying to dodge the discomfort of negative feedback or judgment from others. With type 2, we're seeking to avoid the discomfort of tackling a task when we're not at our absolute best. But the bitter irony is that by giving into these perfectionistic patterns, we usually end up causing ourselves way more discomfort in the long run. What feels good in the moment often doesn't feel good over the long term. Because what can happen with ADHD is that we can think in what's known as first order consequences. So we're only thinking of the immediate consequence of doing or not doing a task. So for example, if I have a pile of work ahead of me, thinking in first order consequences, I only think about if I avoid doing that work right now, I'll feel good right now. Whereas once your mind starts to think in second, third, and fourth order consequences, we start thinking about the long-term impact of our actions. So for example, avoiding that work right now, yes, it'll feel good in the moment, but I still have to do the work. So if I miss that deadline, I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of that deadline. So how does perfectionism impact an ADHDer's ability to learn, grow, and maintain healthy relationships? How can we start to break out of these self-defeating cycles? While we're constantly striving for flawlessness, we don't leave much room for mistakes or failures. And you know what? Making mistakes and experiencing failure are essential parts of the learning process. It's how we figure out what works and what doesn't. It's how we iterate and learn how to do better next time. But when perfection is the only acceptable outcome in our minds, then we become terrified of even the possibility of falling short. As a consequence, we avoid taking risks or even trying to do things because the potential for failure feels too scary for us. We can get really stuck in our comfort zones and start to stagnate instead of growing. And I've been there plenty of times myself and talked myself out of things that I wanted to do because I was worried about the consequences. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to handle them or I would fail them. It wouldn't be perfect. And then there's the toll perfectionism can take on our relationships. When we hold ourselves to impossibly high standards of, all or nothing thinking of succeeding or failing, then it can be easy to start projecting those same standards onto the people close to us. We might find ourselves getting irritated or resentful when friends, family, or partners don't meet our exact specifications. Or we can go in the opposite direction and assume that everyone is judging us as harshly as we judge ourselves. And we put immense pressure on ourselves to be the perfect spouse, the perfect employee, the perfect friend, always saying and doing the right thing. But that pressure leads us to punish ourselves for failing to live up to that. And then we can project that blame onto other people for, making us feel like we have to be perfect, when really, ultimately, the pressure is just within ourselves. So it makes it really difficult to be truly authentic and vulnerable with the people that we care about. And there's research that backs this up. Studies have found strong links between perfectionism and issues like depression, burnout, and relationship troubles. So for ADHDers who are already prone to emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitivity, the combination of all of this can be especially rough. So perfectionistic thinking can really limit an ADHDer's world in a painful way. It can keep us from learning, growing, and forging meaningful bonds with others. And if you do want a deeper dive into all of these concepts and how they work within relationships, then I invite you to join me on my free relationships bootcamp, where we go through step by step how to change and grow yourself in order to build and grow the relationships around you. Click on the link in the description down below to take the next step. So how do we get unstuck from these self-defeating patterns? Well, I want to share with you a little perspective shift that has the power to change things. So there's a few strategies that you can make that make a big difference. And these strategies have also had a big impact on my coaching clients as well. So first up, there's this idea of B- work that I've learned. It's all about letting go of the need to make everything just right and instead aiming for good enough. Now, I know that this may set off an alarm bell in your head right now, the idea of doing something that is just good enough. Instead of agonizing over every single little detail of a project or a situation, you're just essentially giving yourself permission to turn in work that's maybe a B-. It might not be flawless, but it gets the job done. And I know the thought of intentionally not giving 110% can feel really, really uncomfortable at first, but that's kind of the point. Once you start practicing B- work, you get used to that discomfort and it becomes a game changer. You stop procrastinating as much because you're not putting all this pressure on yourself to be perfect right out of the gate, and you actually end up finishing way more stuff because you're not getting tied up or bogged down in the weeds. Have you ever heard the phrase, perfection is the enemy of progress? This is true because perfectionism actually holds you back more than it pushes you forward. Another big one is learning to reframe the discomfort that you're feeling as a chance for growth, not a sign that you're doing something wrong. So for example, if you're working on a task and that voice in your head starts picking up about how it's not good enough or how you should wait for a better time, wait for some perfect scenario where you can do things without any interruptions, instead of buying into these thoughts, you can just choose to see that discomfort as part of the process. It doesn't mean that you're messing up. It means that you're stretching yourself, but in a healthy way. Getting something done is better than getting something perfect. And this kind of ties into the importance of setting realistic goals for yourself. A lot of times our perfectionism convinces us that we need to be aiming for these crazy high benchmarks, but at the end of the day, this sets us up to feel like failures when we inevitably can't reach them. So I'm not saying to lower your standards, but just try to cut yourself some slack and set goals that are actually achievable and then celebrate them when you meet them, even if the end result isn't perfect. Next, a big part of perfectionism is catching and correcting those perfectionistic thoughts in the moment. Like if you notice yourself thinking, this will be a total disaster if it's not absolutely perfect, then you might counter those thoughts with a different perspective. Like, doing this a little messy, a little dirty is okay. It doesn't really define me as a person or the quality of the work that I'm doing. Again, this takes practice, but slowly training your brain to think in a more balanced way can work wonders, and starting to reinterpret the situations and the thoughts that you're having. At the end of the day, beating perfectionism is an ongoing process. It's not about flipping a switch and suddenly just being laid back and chill about everything. But little by little, you can start to untangle yourself from those unhelpful, ineffective patterns and make room for more growth. It's progress, not perfection, right? So yes, perfectionism and ADHD, it is a tricky combination, but at the end of the day, striving for perfection can hold us back in a big way. It can keep us stuck, and it can make us afraid to take risks or put ourselves out there. And when we inevitably can't reach those impossibly high standards, we can beat ourselves up, we can self-flagellate, and we can feel like failures. But you know what? Embracing imperfection is where the real growth happens. It's how we learn. It's what I'm doing right now. I've noticed myself stumbling upon words in the script, and I'm choosing to do it anyway, because at the end of the day, it's better that I get an imperfect video out there than get some perfect video done that is 50 years in the future. And this perfectionism will stop having an impact on not only your personal life, but also your relationships as well. And this fear of failing and rejection is very, very much linked to ADHD in general. And if you do want a deeper dive onto rejection sensitivity and ADHD, then I will leave you with this video right here. I'll see you over there.